Some fighters are forged in gyms, molded by coaches, surrounded by teams. But Evan Tanner was different. He was a lone wolf, a poet in motion, a dreamer who saw the cage as his canvas. He trained himself, self-taught, self-made, and he climbed the mountain to become UFC champion. But Tanner wasn't just a fighter in the cage. He was a wanderer, a seeker, a man chasing life's bigger questions. His journey would end tragically, alone in the desert, a place as vast and untamed as his spirit. So we must dive deeper into the story of a man who fought not just opponents, but his own demons. A champion, a rebel, a myth. This is Evan Tanner, deeper into the cage. What's up, friends? Welcome to my home studio. My name is Robin Black. I am a lifelong martial artist and a connoisseur of combat. Is that overstating it? I just love fighting, and I love getting to talk about it. I was the creative consultant on season 1 of Dark Side of the Cage, and I also got to coordinate and choreograph the fight scenes. So I just love this series. What is this? What are we doing here? Well, this is a hangout or podcast where we go a little bit deeper into some of the subjects that are shown and dissected and examined on the Vice series, Dark Side of the Cage. Dark Side of the Cage, episode 3 is the last days of Evan Tanner. And so today we are going to dig a little deeper into Evan Tanner, chat with a few people who knew him very, very well. Ian Daw, one of his closest friends. Malachy Friedman, who was his jiu-jitsu coach early on. Brilliant guy, fascinating character in his own right. And David Mullins, who is a sports psychology consultant. Chatted with Mullins on the Diego Sanchez episode of Deeper Into the Cage, and people loved it. Really fascinating guy. Sports psychology specialist, worked with world champions, and has some really interesting insights into the mindset of fighters. So let's just get right into it. This is Deeper Into the Cage, Evan Tanner.
What can I tell you about Evan Tanner?
He was this self-trained lone wolf champion in the ring.
Next level.
Loved books. He wanted more than just fighting.
Had a very strong mind.
He was drinking.
He started spiraling.
Evan lost his mind.
I plan on going so deep into the desert that any failure of my equipment could cost me my life.
He called and he goes, "Wade, I think I'm dying of thirst." "What, Evan?" And we lost the signal.
I can't.
Dark Side of the Cage. New episode Wednesday at 10 on Vice.
Okay, before we get our first guest, I want to share a personal story or two about Evan Tanner. Now, our first guest today is actually going to be Ian Daw. And Ian lived with Evan down in Las Vegas. He sort of came into Evan's life, or they came into each other's lives as friends, I think shortly after Evan went through a dark period. We get into all this in the episode of Dark Side of the Cage. But so Ian he trained with him as he was preparing for his first pro MMA fight. And he knew Evan really sort of in a family kind of way. They were very close. They lived together. Malachy, who we'll talk with later, also was very close with Evan. But Ian and I had my first pro MMA fight on the same show as Ian. I believe had his third, and Evan Tanner was in Ian's corner. So the night before our fight, after the weigh-ins, I got to have dinner with Evan Tanner, and I got to pick his brain. There was also a guy named Joe Dirksen who had, I think, 60 plus wins in pro MMA, WEC, all over. And we got to have dinner with both of these two very experienced people. When you're around, brilliant martial artists like this, you gain a lot when you're young and new, which is why Ian has such a unique insight into Evan. Before I bring in Ian, I do want to tell you, Ian was one of his closest friends. And when Evan passed away, there was rumors, in the hours before it was confirmed. And we kind of thought it was rumors. And I confirmed it. And I was the one who had to tell Ian that Evan actually had passed. Ian and I are very close, good friends. We trained together when we were fighting at a low level compared to the Evan Tanners of the world or any of these high level fighters. But we trained together very closely, and I did have to share with him that his dear friend Evan, I had to be the one that confirmed with him that his dear friend Evan had passed away. So I just give you that as context before we bring Ian in. But Evan Tanner was a brilliantly inspiring character. The episode of Dark Side of the Cage goes into it a lot, but if you don't know, he learned to fight by watching old Gracie tapes, VHS tapes. Put them in, practice the movements. That is incredible. We can all, we're all looking for inspiration. We're all looking to achieve what we can with our lives, actualize ourselves to the best that we can. Evan Tanner showed that anything is possible. And it's through that lens that we want to speak to these guests today.
Sometimes I've put down the alcohol, sometimes I haven't. I keep having this idea of what I could do, what I could be if I put the vices aside and dedicated myself to the sport. At the time, I was struggling with drinking too much and not taking care of myself. Evan's MySpace page was a lighthouse through the storm.
80% of people watching this have no idea what MySpace is. But yet, when he would share his real meaningful thoughts on there, it really spoke to people. People really connected with him. Why do you think that is?
I think because it was just the genuine article, right? And I feel like he didn't hide his successes as much as he didn't hide any of his failures or shortcomings. And I think, as initially a fan and a reader of his blogs, I think the message that was conveyed so clearly was this is an individual who has his flaws, but despite all of the issues and shortcomings, he's managed to find success and meaning and value. And when I read his blogs, some of it was quite, like you said, quite dark, and he shared a lot of his lows. But as a reader, to me, it wasn't necessarily negative as much as it was an honest reflection on what he had experienced. And I was never left concerned, right? I was always, interested and more invested in this character and eager to see what was next. And I think he had a very special way of communicating that in a way that anyone could relate to, regardless of, I wasn't fighting at the time, but when he wrote about fights, I felt like I understood, his drinking and some of the issues he shared with like gambling and relationships, maybe not issues that I had experienced, but he conveyed it in a way that I think almost anyone could relate to, which was what made him such a special guy. And, that's MySpace is how I met Evan. That's how I began corresponding with him and eventually led to being roommates. Living with him in Vegas. Wild.
Yeah, think of that. But you said that he was somebody, I'm paraphrasing, but somebody who had his flaws, but was able to, despite them, kind of find successes. Aren't we all ultimately just people who have our flaws and are searching for meaning and trying to be successful despite them?
Yeah, and that's why I think Evan was a bit of a lighthouse in that way. And again, I think I still talk and communicate with people who are part of Team Tanner or people who are fans of his blogs going on how many years now. Yeah. And there's no shortage of people who, people have named their children after Evan. There's people who still share his blogs and he was very, very impactful. And I feel like the messages he conveyed were ones that everyone could relate to and were honest and inspiring in a way, despite sharing all of the shortcomings and issues.
Put yourself in his shoes. Impossible to imagine. We try to be empathetic, and empathy is to imagine what it's like to be you, or what it's like to be somebody who might be watching this. If we try to think what it would be like to be him, it's very difficult, but you attempt to it, and imagine you are somebody reaching out in the world through this new technology, MySpace, and some kid in Canada who's wrestled and fighting is like, I want to fight. How do you end up from a guy, responding to his blogs, to living with him in Vegas, and then him cornering you when we're in Canada years later?
It's so surreal, and in a lot of ways, it seems unbelievable, and the odds are obviously stacked against those that relationship coming to the extent it was. But I think when I started corresponding with Evan, a lot of it was about what he was sharing in his blogs and things I identified with. And as the kind of correspondence and relationship grew, I expressed an interest more in fighting. And then Evan said, when I had booked my first fight, he said, when you're fighting, if you want to come train, you're more than welcome to come to Vegas. I still see posts to this day where people I sent him messages on MySpace and he always responded. So I think that was, he spent a lot of time on MySpace, and there's no shortage of people out there that he corresponded with and had genuine relationships with. Like I said earlier, people have named their children after him. He's changed so many lives. I was just able to right time, right place, and kind of took advantage of the offer when it was extended.
At that time, you and I were training together every day. We were like number one training partners, and you're one of my very closest friends. And we started to hear rumors that day that Evan may have died. And then we didn't want to believe that was so. And I remember I was the one who kind of had to tell you that I think it was true. Do you recall that? Yeah. And then we went out. Sam Zakula, who was one of our coaches, and a few other people, we went out to a Chinese restaurant and just sat there. It's just, that's a surreal thing with any friend or anyone, mentor, family member. That was just it's one of the reasons I really wanted to do this episode and get it right for you,
Yeah. And I remember that day. I think will stand out to me forever. Partially because to me, in the back of my mind, obviously I knew it was true. But also knowing Evan a bit in my mind, he was a bit of a superhero enigma of sorts. And there's no shortage of stories of experiences he had that easily he shouldn't have survived, and he did. So I always kind of held out that little bit of hope that things didn't turn out the way that they did. But that's some other people who were close with him said, looking back on his life, I think he'd be happy with it. Obviously he didn't intend to die, and that wasn't what his mission was out there, but he passed doing what he loved. He was out in the desert on
an adventure. Maximum adventure.
And maximum adventure comes with maximum risk, right? And I think he rode that line, and I think he rode that line most of his life. So maybe that's just me trying to make peace with it. But surreal phone calls and kind of tragic.
Yeah. If he walked out of that desert, what do you think he would have done next? What do you think the next weeks and months and years, what would he be doing today?
Honestly, I think about that all the time, and I miss Evan so deeply. And I think, especially the last few years, I'm always curious as to what his opinion on, the state of the world and state of, humanity would be, because he had such a unique perspective that I feel like his input would be invaluable. In regard to his plans after returning from the desert, so not sure if you're aware, but obviously we had our fight, and Evan and I went back to the hotel afterwards, and the whole weekend, essentially, when we were back in a room, he was researching for the trip. Like, this wasn't an impromptu decision. He didn't just decide to go out ill prepared, right? He got a new motorcycle that he knew would have all the storage he needed. He had all of his supplies, and unfortunately, Mother Nature had other plans, but he was meticulous in his preparation for that outing. And particularly with his health, he had connected with a doctor that, and I think he was going to start some medications to address some of his like hormonal issues and medical issues that were a bit unaddressed. And part of his mission in the desert, he was looking for gold, like actual treasure.
Yeah.
And part of that, I think, Evan also had a dream of getting back the middleweight title. And I don't think he ever lost sight of that. And as far as I was aware and what he communicated to me, he was going to get back, get healthy, get back into training and make a run at the middleweight title.
There's some, what I think is fascinating research was done on this whole idea of sensation seeking, right? So it's been broken down by Zuckerman many decades ago now into 4 different components of sensation seeking, and we kind of score. Everyone can kind of, there's a test you can do. Everyone scores high or low or medium, somewhere in that scale for each of the 4 components. And as we're talking through these, you can kind of think of where Evan Tanner would have fit into that scale, and where other fighters that you might be fans of or be aware of, where they might fit in that scale as well. It might make more sense, the way things work. And it's an interesting way to look at ourselves as well. So in terms of the sensation seeking, there are four different components. So number one, like the idea of thrill and adventure seeking. So we either score high to low on that scale for thrill and adventure seeking. And I mean, yeah, in terms of Evan Tanner, I don't know the guy, never met the guy. I was a fan of his way back, even before he won the title. And but you can imagine he would score high on that scale. Experience seeking, number 2. So seeking out experiences, novel, unique experiences, being open to those. You would score from high to low on that scale. And again, for someone like Evan Tanner, we can imagine he would have scored very high on that scale of experience seeking. Then there's 2 others then in terms of how they kind of shape how the other 2 look. So the first one is disinhibition. So like, think of someone who is, their inhibition is
Lampshade
low.
on the head.
Yeah.
Lampshade on the head at the party.
Yeah. Exactly. So someone with their disinhibition is high. You can again, that would fit. That makes sense. That people with that kind of high disinhibition rating are going to live their life in a very different way to people with that low rating. And then the last component is boredom susceptibility. So how do you rate on that? Do you get bored easily? Do you not get bored easily? If you get bored easily, you need to go and find some thrill and find some excitement quick. You can't just sit alone.
Yeah, a lot of fighters that we see are constant, whether it is the fight or some other activity or the party or whatever. They get bored real easy and need constant stimulation. And Evan Tanner,
Exactly.
presumably, with one of these.
Again, like, without knowing the guy, because I didn't know the guy, but I would predict he would have scored high on all of those, right? Which sounds like a bad thing, but it's not. It's not like this is the bad thing. It's just the way some people are versus other people. Because those people that are high in all those would see people that are low in all of those, or medium to low, would see them as boring, would see them as dull, whatever, So it's not like one is right and one is wrong. What gets really interesting is when you go behind into the brain, into the chemicals involved, because people that score high on this scale, this sensation seeking scale, they tend to have lower levels of cortisol, for example, like the stress hormones. So lower level, even though they're adventure seeking, thrill seeking, and in experience seeking, when they're in those high thrill, high adventure moments, their cortisol levels are actually lower than other people would be. Their stress levels are lower. right? They're more relaxed in that situation than others would be, and their dopamine levels are higher. The dopamine, which we would relate to pleasure, that's higher for those people in those situations. So it's not just that they're drawn to them; it's that they're able to perform in them better, if you want, than other people would be. So
Which is
that's
fascinating.
useful when you think of certain sports or certain like high risk, like fighter pilot or MMA fighter or many other things. It's going to be useful to have, high dopamine levels, low cortisol levels in those really intense thrill-seeking situations.
And not only in the fight, which is great that you'll find pleasure in these moments and feel less stress, but to get into that fight requires tens of thousands of repetitions of the high stress thing, and training for a lifetime. And what do you train at? Things that you enjoy and don't find so stressful that you avoid. So becoming great is directly linked to this as well, because you have to practice so much at what we would all consider a high stress thing. And to do that, it's a lot more enjoyable if it's low stress and high dopamine.
100% true. But then there are some negative side effects, or not side effects, but negative kind of
Consequences.
Consequences. Perfect. For this kind of personality type, this person who scores high on this sensation seeking scale, because when the sport is gone and the sport leaves us all, right? And the sport by its nature, and I'm the sport of MMA, I mean, obviously in this case, it does tick all of those boxes, just the nature of that sport, including, like you're saying, the training, and then obviously the fights and the journey and the whole thing. When that's gone, that doesn't mean that, like, just because the sport's no longer there and you have to retire, doesn't mean that you switch off all of those personality traits and that high for those four components. And that's what we see many fighters fall into the traps with: substance abuse and other things, where they replace those, the dopamine hit with that they might have got from the experience and the thrill. They get it now from chemicals, or from, in Evan Tanner's case, still thrill seeking, still adventure seeking, still pushing himself to an extreme kind of a situation.
All right, one more guest to chat with today about the great Evan Tanner. Fascinating conversations so far. But before we do, I want to share a little bit from the process of making Dark Side of the Cage, the Evan Tanner episode. Very quickly, the young man who played Evan Tanner, when you watch the episode, man, he looks like him. And when I showed Ian and Malachy, closest friends, I showed them photos or took a little video of him from the set and said, this guy's playing Evan. And they were like, whoa, he looks a lot like him. His body language is a lot like him. He's just, the casting, Eddie is the name of the casting director for Dark Side of the Cage. You'll see throughout this season, the casting is unbelievable. It is someone's job to go out into the world and find humans that not only look like this, but can carry the presence. And they have to be capable of telling the stories physically and emotionally. And Eddie, great job, man. The casting of Evan Tanner was brilliant. And the young man who played him, big, strong, athletic, no martial arts training. So during the scenes where we've got him learning from the Gracie tapes, the director, Dwayne, set up the camera from behind the television screen. So we are watching it, and you see the Gracie tape on the screen, and then you see the camera behind, you see the Gracie tape in front, and you see the guy acting it out. And we had him act out segments from that, and he looks rudimentary, but it worked perfectly because he's playing a young Evan Tanner, athletic, quick to learn, just like the actor was, but who didn't yet know it. So things like that, when you're telling these stories, it's just such a beautiful experience. It's a wild type of art form to be able to tell a physical story. A human sitting in a chair, telling something, and we get to reenactment using an actor who was not a martial artist, playing a young man who is not yet a martial artist, learning from tapes. Just so, so cool. People ask a lot of questions about the process of this. Next week on Tough, I'm going to try to give you the simplest 30,000 foot view of what it's like to put together a season of TV. I don't know how well I can describe that in 2 or 3 minutes, but I'll do my very best. But let's get back into it. One more great interview now to do on the great champion and legend and human that was Evan Tanner.
I think it's a ego-driven thing where it's like, I think I might die, but you don't actually believe it. Because he's done this a million times with a million other things that were dangerous. So why shouldn't he get through this one? So I do believe that it wasn't a suicide. I believe it was a suicide mission.
You're a dude who thinks different. You see the world different. You do jiu-jitsu different. When you first got to know Evan Tanner, was he like that? Is he like you that way?
I would say he's a little bit more quiet, a little bit more brooding, but yeah, I think he thinks differently for sure. He's definitely a different guy when it comes to the world in general. So like training and doing different stuff like that, he's interesting, but more so his path of training. So like he had a routine that he drank like a 2-gallon Mountain Dew every weekend before fights. It was like, as long as you do that, as long as you don't stop whatever you're doing. That was his phrase. If you're drinking 2 gallons of Mountain Dew, don't stop drinking 2 gallons of Mountain Dew. So, I mean, he had some interesting insights of like how to do things differently. And also the paleo stuff. I think he was like the first guy to cutting edge on paleo, which is like, he's like, hey, sometimes you're going to eat fish, sometimes you're not. So sometimes we just ate like greens and nuts, and then sometimes we caught a fish, like, theoretically caught a fish, and it's like, oh well, we don't have fire, so you have to eat the fish raw. So some interesting stuff like that for sure.
Man, I find you to be a fascinating cat. I knew this would be an interesting conversation, but you've already hit me with 2 liters of Mountain Dew and raw fish.
Yes, sir.
And today you've got a super successful gym and online business and all kinds of cool shit. And Evan, ultimately passed away. It's strange how life goes that way. That one wrong twist, and we're not where we are.
I think Evan was more committed to the world than I was. If that makes sense. Like to the vibrations of the world. Like there's some people that like. And I don't know, like maybe, like I'm not gonna pretend like I'm like being successful and having a gym and having people, respect your jiu-jitsu and stuff like that isn't amazing. It is a good feeling, but at the same time, sometimes it's an empty feeling too. And I think Evan would have, in my place, if Evan would have done what I was doing, I think he would feel empty in a way because he wanted to fight for his money. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. He didn't want to have to, like I have a kids class in 40 minutes, right? So I can't do exactly what Evan would want to do. Like what Evan would want to do is, so him being not on a time schedule, him being able to pick up and leave and take a motorcycle out to Washington to get training and then drop back down to Vegas. And that's his kind of vibration of like living. And so like, yeah, mine took a bump in a different way because of fear of, well, also because so I injured myself before I really could do anything that I ever wanted to do. I injured my neck while I was training at Top Team, and I had to get a neck surgery, and that didn't work, and so it was just kind of like me digging for some kind of gratification, some kind of recognition, something kind of like, hey, I'm skilled. Here it is. Like, somebody take this. Whereas, I think he was the same way in fighting and the same way in how he expressed himself. I think if he didn't have the attention that he had that he'd be without it. Like he'd be without a lot of, like the way MySpace operated for him was a way for him to be important, because when you're a fighter at that point in that stage in the game, unless you're Chuck Liddell, right? Unless you're this or that, Like, it's a pretty basic and normal life. I mean, a lot of guys knew him, and a lot of people had no idea who he was. You know, so it's not like, and then on the internet, people can all find you in that one spot. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, look, here's a UFC fighter. Here's a UFC fighter that's actually engaging with his audience, you know, rather than you have somebody like Vanderlei Silva, or you have somebody like Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz, where those guys don't really even have to communicate with their fans in order to communicate with their fans. So,
yeah, Malachy, thank you for hanging, man. We're going to do this more. I love chatting with you, but I'll let you get back to your kids' class soon. But before I do, if Evan Tanner had come out of the desert that day, I know we're just making it up in our mind, but where do you think he would have gone? And what do you think the next weeks and months and years of his life might have looked like? What would it look like if he was here today?
So that's an interesting question, because I don't like, so I hadn't had really contact with Evan during that period of time of him sobering himself up to him, like, where the boat got he sank the boat, got sobered up, and then was going to ride through the desert. And I brought up kind of like was it Point Break, where like you kind of know so he knew about modern the electronics and the satellite. He knew that there was things like that could save you, right? So I remember, because he was going over this kind of stuff. He was going to do like a wooded trail or something like this, and he knew that there was things that for a certain amount of money that you could hit a button and it would send an SOS to a satellite, and the satellite would then give your location and would send rescue. I'm not sure if it was I'm pretty sure he did not want to die. I think he was too embarrassed to get help if he did, and he would figure out a way, and it would be just another story. I'm not sure if he would be sober or clean, to tell you the truth. You know what I mean? Because it was only a small amount of time that he was sober, and he was in pain, a lot of emotional pain, and he had a really bad vice of drinking. I think he could be a really good coach. I think he could be like Bo Jackson, where Bo Jackson, nobody knows where Bo Jackson is. Just recently, I saw an interview with Bo Jackson. That dude is living a normal life. But you see all these other celebrities all the time, all over the paper, all over this, all over that. You don't hear about Bo Jackson at all. That's one of the most huge, like, giant stars of like ever, of like the 80s and early 90s was Bo Jackson. You know, Bo knows. And he's living in a small town with a ranch, and he doesn't go out and do much. I can see Evan being that way as well. Maybe trying to write some books. Maybe he'd pop up on Twitter and tell somebody, like, disagree with the way somebody's viewing something. But I definitely think it would be secluded. I definitely think if he was coaching, he would be coaching just a small amount of fighters here and there. Or he may not be sober. That's the thing, is that it's a very hard, because when we lost him, he was in a turning point of his life. We don't know what was after that, you know? So.
Whew. Evan Tanner's the kind of guy that can, you know, really inspire a lot of people. You can tell from the chats we've had today, and you know, people talking about this episode with me. He was a rare and special one. By the way, each of those conversations, Chase, my editor, selected good chunks to share with you here in Deeper Into the Cage, but we have all those conversations in their entirety over on Cage Talk. You can find it on Vice YouTube, and you can find it in Vice Podcasts. So please check those out. Some fascinating, more layers to those conversations. But I guess the last thought is, you know, Evan Tanner was one of these guys who lived his life to the fullest as long as he lived it. And we try to draw inspiration from that, and we hope to all do the same. It would be great if we all lived till 100, but no matter how long we live and how long we're here, we want to draw the most we can out of every moment that we have. And maybe we learn that a little more from Evan Tanner. But in the coming weeks, we've still got 7 more episodes. Dark Side of the Cage is on Vice Sports. It's on Vice TV, Crave in Canada. You can find it. Make sure you do find it. 10 episodes, 10 beautiful stories. And we'll come back next week, Sunday on YouTube, and sometime next week, wherever you find your Vice podcasts, and go a little bit deeper into the cage. Until then, I'm Robin Black. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
What can I tell you about Evan Tanner?
He was this self-trained lone wolf champion in the ring.
Next level. Loved books. He wanted more than just fighting.
And a very strong mind.
He was drinking.
He started spiraling.
Evan lost his mind.
I plan on going so deep into the desert that any failure of my equipment could cost me my life.
He called and he goes, Wade, I think I'm dying of thirst. What? Evan? And we lost the signal.
I can't.
Dark Side of the Cage. New episode Wednesday at 10 on Vice.